You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, the World Health Organization warns of a health catastrophe without climate action. As ministers clash over the energy crisis, we look at how other countries are dealing with the demand on gas. Environmental protesters barricade themselves in tunnels to halt HS2 construction. And George Clooney talks to Sky News about his hopes for COP26. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. Now, the repercussions of climate change are already being felt right around the world. And now the World Health Organization and 45 million health professionals have warned against the direct impacts of carbon emissions and rising temperatures on people's health. In a new report released in the last couple of hours and ahead of the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow, the WHO said countries must set ambitious national climate commitments if they're to sustain a healthy and green recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Putting the health argument really at the centre to accelerate the negotiations at COP26 in Glasgow this year. So we all hope that this recovery after COVID-19 could incorporate our health arguments, because we are convinced that the health will be the motivation to do much more and to accelerate action on climate change.
So let's take a look at some of the main points from the report. And it says that air pollution is responsible for around 7 million deaths globally per year, with around 99% of the world's population living in places where air quality levels exceed WHO limits. But bringing down air pollution could reduce the total number of global deaths by 80%. Now, globally, 1 in 5 deaths are associated with poor diets, and the WHO recommends that a shift to more nutritious diets would prevent up to 5.1 million diet-related deaths a year by 2050. And extreme heat led to more than 365,000 deaths in 2019, and the WHO warns that that number will rise. Well, we can go now to Lodwar in Kenya and our health correspondent Ashish Joshi. So, Ashish, a pretty dramatic warning from the WHO. Just how much resonance will it have where you are?
Oh, you can see it everywhere, Anna. The warning by the WHO comes after it spends time in places like North Kenya. There's a drought here. It's an arid area, so it's used to being dry. The people here have lived for generations with very little water. But in some places, they're telling me they haven't seen rainfall since 2017. We visited a town near a big lake, Lake Turkana in the north here. It's a saltwater lake, a township which can't use the water from the lake because it's a saltwater lake, so they rely on one single river. Now, this single river is just a dry, flat bed where children are boring holes into the ground to extract fresh water to drink. And there's 100,000 people who live in this township who all rely on these small boreholes in the ground. I spoke to women today who work with separate schemes to try and help them to earn new livelihoods because they've lost all their cattle, they've lost all their sheep through this drought. There's nowhere to take these animals out to pasture. If you lose your animals, you lose your livelihood. So there is this a real crisis which is building here. 2.5 million people in Kenya alone are said to be in danger of this food shortage, and that's why the Kenyan government has taken action to try and encourage large organizations like the World Food Programme, like the United Nations, to make interventions now before this emergency turns into a crisis.
Ashish, thanks very much indeed. Now, wholesale natural gas prices remain high today, climbing by 7% to 209p per therm and well above the 40 to 60 pence range where gas has traded in recent years. Now Sky News understands that the government has made a formal request of the Treasury to support industries hit by high energy prices. Well, let me just take you over to our data dashboard now, and you can see up at the top where the UK is getting its energy from right now. And you can see that 55% is currently coming from fossil fuels. That's primarily gas. We've got 31% there coming from renewables, and meanwhile, we've got 14% coming from nuclear. But that power mix differs depending on where you are in the world. Sky's science correspondent Thomas Moore has been looking at how decisions on energy have affected other countries.
The eye-watering spike in the cost of gas is painful for consumers and businesses. This is the price of wholesale gas, and it's up more than 500% since the start of the year. All countries are facing the same stratospheric surge in prices, but when it comes to generating electricity, some are better insulated against the impact. Let's look at the UK's energy mix at midday on Monday. Gas made up almost 50%, renewables around a quarter, nuclear a little over 10%, and there's a little bit there from coal too. Compare that to last October and you can see renewables are roughly the same, but we're using a lot more gas now. And that's to make up for a sharp drop in nuclear generation, as half a dozen reactors have been shut down for maintenance. It's a very different situation in France. There, almost 80% of electricity is generated with nuclear energy. Gas makes up less than 10%, significantly less than the UK, so the direct impact on electricity consumers is much lower. France also generates enough energy to export to other countries. Germany also has a very different energy mix to the UK. Just 13% of its electricity was generated with gas at midday. But look at coal. It made up almost a third. But Germany's heavy use of coal comes with a climate cost. The dirtiest of all the fossil fuels produces the equivalent of around 800 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt of energy. That's twice as much as gas. For comparison, offshore wind is just 10 grams per kilowatt.
Coal just does not fit inside the carbon budgets that we have, and it doesn't fit inside the international commitments that we're signing up to. And on the economics point, it's cheaper than gas at the minute. But the lesson from the gas crisis should be that fossil fuel prices are very fickle, very volatile, and coal could just as easily become expensive another time. So rather than trying to pick the least worst fossil fuel and hoping it stays cheap, you should be trying to move away from fossil fuels entirely back to homegrown renewables.
The energy crunch is worldwide. India's 135 coal power stations, which generate 70% of the country's electricity, have their own supply crisis. More than half have stocks to last just 3 days, with blackouts a growing reality. As economies are restarting after the pandemic, energy is in high demand.
In some of today's other climate news, 24 countries, including Pakistan and Japan, have joined the US and EU and committed to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030, signing up to the Global Methane Pledge. Methane is the second biggest cause of climate change after carbon dioxide. China has promised to include biodiversity in its economic plans on the first day of the COP15 Biodiversity Conference. World leaders have gathered virtually to discuss a framework for slowing the loss of nature and species ahead of face-to-face talks in China in April next year. A solar flare is likely to hit Earth today, which could disrupt power grids and satellites. The US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has issued an alert for a G2 geomagnetic storm, which means it's moderately strong. It could also boost the intensity of the northern lights, making them visible in parts of England and New York. Now, security officers are trying to remove environmental protesters from a network of tunnels which have been created to halt construction of the High Speed 2 rail project. Enda Brady reports from Buckinghamshire.
Extraordinary security operation underway at this wooded area on the outskirts of Wendover here in Buckinghamshire. Let me just show you where the protesters now are. So they've managed to construct this kind of makeshift tree camp, if you will, a tower of pallets, wooden pallets that goes all the way up, and there is a ladder all the way down through the middle of it, and that then takes you down into the tunnels. The protesters' supporters tell me that there is a network of tunnels that they have painstakingly created over the past few months, and there are at least 4 people down there, and amongst them a very well-known environmental activist called Swampy. His real name is Daniel Hooper, 48 years of age. He was actually in court last week, numerous offences. The judge threw them all out. Every charge against him was dropped last week, and I'm told Swampy was driven directly from Highbury Magistrates Court in North London to here, where he has gone underground. And if we just pan around this way, I'll just show you this extraordinary security operation. If we walk down a little bit, I just want to show you just how many security officers there are here, the whole way down. These are all private security officers. There are bailiffs here as well. Thames Valley Police are here, and British Transport Police. And this is day 2 of this tunnel occupation, as the protesters and their supporters are calling it. They say that they will try and do what they did at Euston Station, which was to stay underground for a month. They say they have supplies, provisions, and that they will keep going.
Now, we should warn you, this next story contains flashing images from the start. And with less than 3 weeks to go before the COP26 conference in Glasgow, George Clooney says he's hopeful but not optimistic that it will lead to much progress. Speaking at the UK premiere of his new film, The Tender Bar, the actor said the climate summit stands better chances of achieving something than US Congress does.
Listen, there's better chances here than we've had in the United States recently, because our Congress lives in a bit of a state of denial. It used to not be a political situation. Nixon used to do something about this, quite honestly. So I'm disappointed with the way and the directions that our Congress has gone. So I'm hopeful that more will be done here. I think some will, but I'm not all that optimistic about it. I don't know. I'd like to be. I'm a pretty optimistic guy.
And coming up after the break, we'll be discussing how UK manufacturers are urging the government to give workers the necessary training to decarbonise the sector. A new report from Make UK and Sage has found 92% of companies believe they can reach net zero targets by 2050 with the government's help. So my guests for that are Emily Shuckburgh from Cambridge Zero and Dan Caesar from The Fully Charged Show. They'll be here to discuss that and more. That's coming up after the break.
The government has got an ambitious target that will reduce our emissions by 2/3 by 2035. And businesses are a core part of that. So we've taken a look at the biggest businesses in the UK, and we've disappointingly found that only 19% have got a plan to reach net zero. Now, more of them have got a target, and that's welcome that we've got a target, but obviously what's really important is that you've got a plan to meet that target. And as I say, only 19% have made that plan, and we can see that plan. So what we're calling for is the government to stop the gap and not expect that they're going to get these emissions reductions unless we have legislation for plans and mandatory transition plans. In the run-up to the landmark COP conference that we've got coming up in Glasgow in only a few weeks' time, we've got businesses falling over themselves to talk about net zero. And as I say, there is a lot of commitments out there. But commitments are one thing, a plan is a very different thing. You know, I compare it a bit like to a pizza box. There's calories on a pizza, but it doesn't mean to say you're going to stop eating it or lose weight. A weight management plan is a very different proposition. And so whilst we do welcome the companies that have come forward with net zero commitments, there are over a quarter left in the FTSE who haven't, and we'd urge them to come forward with commitments. We're also saying we need that plan. A government needs to step in. The window for voluntary action has gone. We all know that. The science is terrifying. We've all got to step up now and make sure we're on that trajectory towards net zero with credible plans alongside those credible commitments. The government is saying this is their big issue. So if this is their big issue and they're putting a plan on the table and they want everybody to come on board and support them doing that, they need to set the criteria in place. And so we need legislation to make sure there's a level playing field. And actually, some of those leading businesses are saying, please do it, because at the moment, we're all in this sort of no man's land with various commitments of different ambition levels. And actually, we all want to move together. If we move together, not only is that good for the climate, but it could be really good for the UK. There's a lot of business opportunities for those who go first and go fastest.
Cercando as áreas, limpando as áreas e progressivamente avançando com os plantios. Isso daqui é uma sentença de morte para os manguezais.
Did you know that driving us to school creates extra toxic air at drop-off and pick-up times?
There'll be a mainly dry morning with sunny spells, best in the southwest, but the cloudier north and east can expect a little rain at times. There'll be some fog on northern coasts and hills. Temperatures will be much like today's. The afternoon will bring little change, although northern and eastern England will see patchy rain developing a bit more widely. We've got clean Atlantic air spreading from the northwest, so the air pollution index, where 1 means low pollution and 10 means very high, will be low everywhere.
The Air Quality Report, sponsored by Philips Air Purifiers.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with Director of Cambridge Zero and climate scientist Emily Shuckburgh and Chief Executive of the Fully Charged Show, Dan Caesar. So welcome to both of you. Good to see you both. So first of all, net zero. Now, we hear that phrase from political and business leaders every day. It means reducing carbon emissions by as much as possible and then offsetting the rest. And while a growing number of companies have set targets to reach net zero by 2050, fewer of them have released detailed plans. So, Emily, to you first of all, the government's asked companies to voluntarily release their net zero plans. I think particularly they want to do it ahead of COP. But do you think it should be mandatory?
Well, I certainly think it's incredibly important. I mean, first of all, let's say it's fantastic that increasing number of businesses are starting to recognise the importance of putting in place net zero targets, but then also about trying to work out how they're going to actually achieve those with actual detailed plans from today, because we need action today and we need to understand what can be done today rather than off in the distant future. So I do think it's really important that businesses, do recognise the challenge and then respond to it.
Well, yes, and it's interesting you say an increasing number because the WWF released some details that said that only 19% of major UK companies, they say, there we go, have published a detailed action plan for reaching net zero. So, Dan, if you do say, force all companies to release a plan, do you also need that audited in some way? Do you need the plans to be seen to be credible and also for any progress to be monitored?
Well, there are exceptions to every rule, of course, but at the moment companies aren't doing enough. And I agree with Emily, it's great to see that so many companies are taking it seriously, but a lot of companies are still indulging in greenwash, frankly. So you really can't rely on an industry to police itself or investors to police that industry either. And that's why what government says at COP26 is going to be so important, because they need to level the playing field. They need to be clear on what we need to do next. And it is time for action and not words.
So sorry, Dan, you want the government to sort of lay out parameters for businesses, do you? Is that what you're calling on from them?
I think governments in general, I wouldn't even just say it's just a UK government thing. This is a global challenge, but I think UK government has a strong role to play as we're hosting COP26, and I would like to see them go much, much further than they have done before in terms of being clear on net zero and what businesses, particularly energy-intensive industries, need to do next.
Well, yes, and there's a point there, isn't there, Emily, that different businesses have very different needs in terms of reaching net zero. I think Cambridge University set out plans to reach net zero by 2038 last year, but that's a very different prospect to a steel company or an airline trying to get to net zero.
No, absolutely. So each different sector is going to have its own challenges. I think one of the really critical things, though, and you mentioned it a moment ago, is that the need within that net zero to do everything that you can as a business to reduce your emissions and leave offsetting really to those aspects that absolutely cannot be reduced. So one example would be, for example, in terms of business travel, if everyone was just saying, oh, we're going to offset all our business travel, continue as normal, then we simply wouldn't have enough offsets to go around. Businesses need to be looking at how they can reduce their emissions, travel less. We're all doing it, in many business interactions virtually instead at the moment because of the pandemic. That needs to be ingrained in terms of normal business action. That's just one of a myriad of examples where the first thing ought to be cutting our emissions and then reserving offsetting only for those things that really cannot be cut.
So that's what business can do. And going back down to what you think governments should do, you talked about them setting out frameworks. What about also making clear what their priorities are in the future, whether it's investing in green hydrogen or green steel or carbon capture? Does that make a difference to businesses in knowing how to go about making their own plans?
It does, and frankly, there are a huge amount of technologies on the table, and that's useful, but it's become less productive, I would say. There's more options now than are needed, and some work better than others. So I think a more focused approach. I think if you're a fan of renewables like I am, you would actually say that maybe things like carbon capture and storage and green hydrogen are a little way off, and we should be focusing on the now technologies like batteries, wind and solar. And in terms of the energy intensive stuff, maybe we need to have a really hard discussion as consumers, as people who consume, about do we need to consume as much steel, glass, paper, etc. And I think that's the big question that we should all be asking ourselves.
Yeah, and we're talking a little bit about consumers next, actually, because gas prices continue to spike, hitting high levels for both consumers and businesses. But could the volatility of gas prices push consumers to invest in greener alternatives, such as renewable energy in the home? Emily, do you think this gas price rise, obviously it's bad news for consumers and businesses, but is there a possibility that it'll prompt a change in behaviour from individuals? Will people think, right, I'm going to put solar panels on now? Do you think it could push some kind of change?
Well, I think, basically everyone would like to have clean, affordable energy without the sort of price spikes that we've suddenly found that we're all having to respond to as a result of having that big reliance, as we still currently do, in terms of oil and gas for heating our homes and powering our transport. And renewable technologies do offer an alternative, but in themselves they're not sufficient, because you might say, well, what's going to happen if the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine? Aren't we similarly going to get those price spikes? So it absolutely needs to be combined with investment in things like smart grids to balance supply and demand better, but also in terms of energy storage, grid scale energy storage, so that we can store up the energy when the wind is blowing and then use it when the wind is blowing less.
You're nodding there, Dan.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I completely agree what Emily says. I mean, my interest really is in the home and buildings, I think. And from my perspective, there are some more expensive technologies, and I think that can run the risk of actually making people not want to participate. But there are cheaper things that can be done. Okay. I think from a consumer's perspective, there are some cheaper options and some more expensive ones too.
Well, yeah, and on that, I'm just going to take a look at a statistic I found really interesting. The average cost of a solar panel system is almost £6,000. That's 50% cheaper than 10 years ago. So it's really interesting how prices are coming down, but it's still a big outlay for an individual, isn't it?
In the first instance, we'd actually push people towards things that are easy to do, like insulation, for example, energy efficiency measures, maybe get a smart thermostat, look at which rooms you need energy in and which ones that you don't, aerated shower heads. There are some actual cheaper options, and also shopping around to buy renewable electricity from a supplier. And then there are some more expensive options as well. And I think things like heat pumps and zero emission boilers are going to play a huge role in this transition over the next decade too.
We've only got about 10 seconds, Emily. Have you got one little tip for consumers here?
I don't, 10 seconds, I don't know.
That was such an unfair question. I'm going to let you off the hook. Next time you come on, I might revisit that and give you a bit of chance to think. We're out of time, though. Emily and Dan, really good to see you both. Thanks very much indeed. Do stay with us. We've got plenty more coming up in just a moment, including the Business Secretary asked the Treasury for help as businesses struggle to cope with soaring energy costs. Now, Dermot Monaghan is up next. He'll have all the latest on that story on Sky News tonight. And, of course, we'll be back again tomorrow. So do join us then. Thanks for watching.